Good evening and welcome to this really exciting King's Talk in relation to journalism. As most of you know, I'm Greg Hunter, I'm the Deputy Co-Curricular here at King's, and we're absolutely privileged to welcome back Ashitha Nagesh tonight after leaving Mitchelton's house some 12 years ago. And now she is an award-winning journalist for BBC Online. Interviewing Ashitha will be our former head of English and in charge of magazines Canterbury and Mind's Eye, Mr. Anthony Lyons. After the interview and presentation from Ashitha, we'll be taking questions from you, the audience. Please, at any time, feel free to type your question into the Q&A function as part of Zoom. Alternatively, put your virtual hand up after the presentation, and we can put you live on the air to ask the question yourself. I'm really looking forward to this, so it's a great pleasure now. I pass you over to Ashitha and Anthony. Anthony. You just need to unmute yourself, Anthony.
Sorry, apologies. Hi everyone, start again. Good evening, Ashitha. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming tonight. First of all, Ashitha, could you tell us, because obviously a lot of the pupils won't have been here, 8 years ago. What have you been up to since you left King's?
So I left King's in 2008. Then I took a gap year and spent that working in a newspaper office in Bangalore, and then subsequently for a magazine in London, an architecture magazine actually. And then I went to KCL, King's College London, and studied English literature. And after that, I did a master's in history of art and spent a couple of years working as an arts journalist, focusing on reviews of exhibitions and also doing some critical analysis. Then I decided to make a change to news. So in 2014, I did what's known as an NCTJ, short course type thing, requalified as a news reporter, and then that's how I got started in news reporting. And now I'm a news reporter, but also as a current affairs features journalist, which is what I'm going to talk about today.
Great, thank you very much for that. Could you clarify, just before we begin, the difference between a newspaper report and a feature? Because I was reading some of your work in the last few days, and you warned me in an email that one of them was 5,000 words long. And I think a lot of our audience won't think of a journalist writing news as writing 5,000 words, which is longer than most short stories. So what do you actually mean by a features journalist as opposed to a reporting or news report journalist? What's the difference?
Sure. So a news report, like you said, it'll be much shorter. Typically, it'll be a sort of news scoop, and you're just presenting the impartial. I mean, my features are impartial as well. I work for the BBC, but you're presenting the straight facts. It's a straight report. You're just saying what happened. Here it is. Here's the news. A feature goes into a lot more detail. You do a lot more interviews, and you're telling people's stories. So it might be one person's particular story, or it might be a collection of people who have had similar experiences or even opposing experiences, but then you paint a much richer, more rounded picture of what's happening. So for some of my stories, a news report preceded them, and then I looked into it in more detail for a feature.
So a news report is quite short term, and the feature is quite long term.
Exactly.
Long term. Okay, you're covering that. Okay. Well, as I said, I've been reading a number of your articles, which are very moving, and they're also very humbling to read. And a lot of the material that you cover means that the reader really shouldn't have any complaints about anything at the end. The kind of people you interview. And I gather that what you'd like to do, first of all, this evening, is talk about two particular articles that you've published this year. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, that's right. Okay. So you want to talk about those, the provenance of those articles, where the ideas come from, how they are produced and researched, and then finally published. Okay.
Exactly.
So, well, over to you then. Would you like to talk about those two pieces?
Sure thing.
Okay,
I'm just going to share my. Here we go. Yes, so like you said, I'm going to talk about two particular articles that I published this year. One of these is, here we go, an interview I did with a slaughterhouse worker, a former slaughterhouse worker, which was published in January this year. And the other one is this piece I wrote in April about an Uber driver who in London who died of coronavirus after being evicted from his home. So I just want to start off by talking about how and why I came to these stories and how I produced them. So initially, before working on any story, you need to figure out what you actually want to write about, what sort of topic you're interested in. Sometimes your editor will come to you and say, I want you to look at blah, blah, blah. And then you go and do it. That's pretty straightforward. With both of these were stories that I found, and I found the people I wanted to speak to, and then I took that to my editor and I pitched it and got it commissioned that way. So with the slaughterhouse worker story, this has been something I've been interested in for actually a few years. I came across an old blog kept by a slaughterhouse worker in America a few years ago, and he wrote about suffering from PTSD, suffering from nightmares and flashbacks from his work, and other like depression and anxiety and other mental health issues. It was a completely compelling experience that I'd never really considered before. And then so I spent a few years trying to look into this in more detail, and also in this country. So that's why I started off on this one. This I knew at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic in March and April that gig economy workers, which is something I've got a special interest in, but gig economy workers were still having to work through the lockdown. They were classified as essential workers, but suffered a lot of issues even before COVID, like insecure work, low wages, and other things that would perhaps put them at much greater risk of getting the virus. So I was keeping my eyes open for people's stories, and I just had my ears open before I came to this story.
Could I ask a
yes.
question at that point? Could you please explain for the audience exactly what is meant by gig economy?
Oh, yes, of course. So
it does feature in quite a few of your pieces, yes?
Yes, absolutely. So the gig economy is sort of it's a form of insecure work, which means that people will not be on a set contract, like a full-time contract, and it won't be a permanent contract. So it's sort of like working freelance. You can have bogus freelance or bogus self-employment contracts where you're essentially working full-time and long hours, or your boss doesn't let you change your hours and you don't have the control that being self-employed would give you, but you're classified as self-employed so that you have fewer rights in terms of like workers' legislation, health and safety and things like that. It can also mean with some courier jobs, or in the case of Uber drivers, they're responsible for the costs of a lot of their work. So say they were staff, they would have their cars paid for them because that's something they need to work. But because they're in a gig economy setup and they're self-employed, they have to pay for their own cars, their own maintenance. I wrote another story about a courier who had to pay for his own uniform and everything else he needed for work, but because he was technically self-employed, the responsibility fell on him. So that's in a nutshell. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's how I came to those stories. So I then had to think about finding the right person to speak to, and with any story, that is probably the most important aspect of it. So with the slaughterhouse worker story, it was a bit of a tricky one to find someone to speak to, because slaughterhouse workers are sort of famously reclusive. The vast majority of slaughterhouse workers in this country and in the US are migrant workers with low proficiency in English. So they might not feel confident enough to speak to me in English. And also it's a very precarious form of work, and and it's low wage, so they won't feel comfortable speaking to a journalist and risking their job. So how I went about this was I managed to find a full list of slaughterhouses in the UK. There are about 150 on there also. And I worked through each one, looked up the nearest town to each slaughterhouse, and then contacted any community centre, church, any kind of community area in the nearest town that I could find on the details for online. Must have sent out hundreds and hundreds of emails or made hundreds of phone calls. And eventually, after going through the entire list, one person got back to me and said that they would be willing to speak to me on condition of anonymity. This story was quite different. So I read about Rajesh Jayaseelan, the Uber driver in this story. I read about his death in a news report, literally a couple of lines in a news report about Uber drivers generally. And I was quite struck by his story because it was particularly tragic how he was evicted from his home. And I wanted to look at the links between insecure work and insecure housing, and how people in this kind of work are more likely to be vulnerable to being evicted from their housing. So deciding who to speak to for this, it was pretty straightforward. I knew I wanted to speak to his best friend who had given a quote to the news report, and also to his widow who lived in Bangalore. So fortunately, I managed to find his friend quite easily because he lives in London. And then I asked his friend to put me in touch with Rajesh's wife. And Rajesh's wife, quite luckily, spoke Kannada, which is my family's language. So I managed to interview her in her own language. That takes us to the next sort of step, which is interviewing often quite vulnerable people. With the person I spoke to for the slaughterhouse story, they had suffered PTSD and quite severe depression, suicidal ideation, and had left the job about 6 years ago, but was still dealing with the effects of this work. When you're talking to someone about this kind of thing, it's good to keep in mind that they are sharing their most vulnerable, most traumatic, literally traumatic in this case, experiences with you. And so it's good to take your time, and there's no need to go in with like a set long list of questions. When I first started as a journalist and interviewing people and writing features, the first couple of times I did it, I was nervous, and I made a long list of questions that I just wanted to ask them. Went bam, 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 bam through the questions, and to the point where I wasn't properly engaging with what they were saying to me. Now I treat it much more just like a conversation. I literally go in with one initial question, which is just tell me a bit about yourself. And then based on that, I can ask them follow-up questions. And I like to spend quite a bit of time. I'm lucky that I have the time to do this, but I like to spend quite a bit of time just getting to know them, allowing them to feel comfortable with me and letting them get to know me. And, you know, then they open up a lot more. So this person, I interviewed them I was on the phone to them for about 3.5 hours. So it's quite a long chat by using current affairs standards. Plus another follow-up 2-hour phone call to clarify some details and chat to them in more detail about certain things. So that's one thing. The other thing is to remember that when you're talking to people who've suffered trauma or any other kind of severe, like negative experience, you'd never want to try and put yourself in their place. You don't want to say, oh, I know how you feel, or this reminds me of when I experienced blah, blah, blah. It's not about you. Just you give that person the space and freedom to just talk freely about what they want to talk about. And then that's when you get the better stories. It was the same with talking to Rajesh's wife, Mary. She was obviously newly bereaved. She was still grieving. We spoke probably about a couple of weeks after her husband had died. So again, you just have to take it really slowly, give them the space to talk at their own pace, and ask them sort of what seemingly mundane questions first, like how are you, what are you, what have you been up to? Like, tell me about yourself, your life. And then just, tell me a bit about Rajesh. And then she just we spoke for a few hours, and she told me about him and his life, how much he loved London. And it was all these little details about him as a person, creating this rounded picture of who he was and not just what had happened to him, that really helped her feel comfortable with me, and also made the piece a lot better. So then once you've spoken to someone, that's the hardest bit of the story done. The next bit is the easy bit, which is just writing it up. Especially if you're fortunate enough to have editors who let you write nice long stories like the one Anthony referred to earlier. It's really easy. And also if you have the foundation of the English department at King's, and so you'll find it nice and easy to write a nice eloquent piece. But the thing to remember is you don't need to go over the top with your writing. You don't need loads of flowery adjectives. If you just keep it quite plain and straightforward, just explain what the person has told you, tell their story in their own words, then I think usually the stories speak for themselves. And it can be a lot more powerful than if you try and impose a feeling onto it. Just, you just tell the story and let the people feel what they feel when they read it. And then finally, it's published. My pieces are published online mainly, but a couple of them have been turned into radio pieces that accompany them. So this one was a written piece, but then I also asked the people I interviewed if I could record the calls, and then later got their permission to use it for a radio piece. And then so it was turned into a radio package that was broadcast on World Service Radio as well. So I think, that's probably a good place to go to questions if anyone has any. I'll stop. Thanks.
Ashitha, thank you so much for that incredibly lucid account of from conception to production. I'm going to be rather cheeky to start with while we're waiting for things to come in.
Yeah.
The most cliched question a journalist can ask is, how do you feel? Those two articles that you read, I found, as I said at the beginning, I found myself profoundly moved. The slaughterhouse one is shocking, profoundly shocking. And the second one, the tragedy of that man's death is remarkably devastating. And I just wondered how you, when you're speaking to these people, how you control yourself and how you deal with the whole business of meeting them, asking them, and then writing about such horrendous things, which of course is necessary, but it must be very painful.
Yeah, I think I'd be lying if I said it was easy, or that you can just put on a poker face and get on with it because it's your job. That's and it's quite a damaging view as well. This sort of man up, you've got to be strong. It's not really the case. Some of these topics are quite heavy going. You do get used to it. It does become easier with time, but of course you should always be mindful of your own mental health when you're working on certain topics. The way I think about it is I'm glad that I'm able to tell people's stories, and that does make me feel a bit better about it. And what drew me to both, like for example, both of these articles that I used as examples, is that they aren't just standalone stories, but they sort of represent a greater systemic societal issue. And by shining a light on it, I hope I'm helping to do something about it. So there is that sense. Just generally, working in the COVID pandemic was, especially in the beginning, was quite heavy going. Not just because of the actual subject material, even though that's by far the worst thing about it, but in terms of long hours, our workload just sort of tripled, quadrupled as well, and so you've got working with no days off, very little sleep, and then you're speaking to people about quite serious, like awful tragedies. I guess it's just important to take time and I guess, yeah, I'm not really sure how else to answer that apart from to say, yeah, it's hard sometimes.
So an underlying moral purpose makes the emotional cost worthwhile.
It does, yes, but you obviously, I don't want to say, oh, it's fine, and you should always be mindful of your own mental health and how you're feeling. But
thank you so much. We've got some we've got some lovely questions here on my right. Excuse me for leaning into the screen. Right, well, we've got here a wonderful question here from Alex Ferguson. Can you believe it? Alexander Ferguson. Thank you, Ashitha, for your courageous work that highlights the plight of vulnerable and marginalised people. As a former Reuters reporter and editor, I'm all too aware of how day-to-day news can crowd out features or investigative work, as well as the bias to report about more important people by media. All true. How did you carve out the time to do these important stories and get your editors to support your work, given these pressures? Schoolhouse, 1972 to 77. Thank you very much, Alexander. Wonderful question.
yes, thank you. I was really lucky actually that we had a special team that was set up of editors who were focused only on commissioning coronavirus features. So for the Uber driver story, for example, I was able to go to them and discuss it, and then it was commissioned. Just generally, so before my current role as a reporter, I focused on features full time. Now in my current role, I most of the time I will do it in my own time, or I'll sort of negotiate some time to focus on features with my editors, depending on who's on shift. Sorry, this is a very practical kind of answer, boring answer, but and at the moment I'm doing a secondment where I'm focusing full time on features again. So I'm lucky, actually. I'm quite fortunate to be able to focus on them full time as part of my job.
You're obviously in the right department, aren't you? I have a thank you, Alexander, for that wonderful question. We have a question here from a contemporary pupil in the middle school. It's from Jack Pelling, who wrote an article last year about Hong Kong. He actually lives in Hong Kong. What qualities do you think makes a good journalist? There you go.
It's hard to say. Definitely curiosity is the biggest one. You have to be good at talking to people. You can't really be scared of picking up the phone. But it's hard to say. I mean, anyone can be a journalist, really. I think it's such a broad industry. There are so many different kinds of journalism that there's sort of something for everyone.
Okay, there you are. Jack,
curiosity definitely is the biggest one.
Open season for you. Can I just remind people in the audience that if you want to press your hand button, a little hand will come up, and you can speak directly to Ashitha if you would like to do so. Yes, this is from a member of staff, Andrew McFall, in the maths department, and this is a very good question, because he's asked, what is the future for newspaper journalism, although you're online, of course, but a newspaper journalism in an increasingly technological world where news reporting can be pretty much instant? I mean, we're all familiar with falling sales and so on, but what is the future, do you think?
So before I joined the BBC, I worked for Metro newspaper, but again for their website, so I'm strictly online, really. Newspapers, in the traditional newspapers, funding is being cut. They're just not selling, really, and so the future looks bleak, if I'm honest. But online journalism is growing massively, digital journalism, and it's this old snobbery of print is better than online is sort of fading away now. People are realizing that you can have really strong reach, and obviously online articles last forever, or basically forever, compared to newspaper articles. So for example, I think a print newspaper could have a circulation of a few 100,000, a good, which is pretty good circulation, I think. But well, like both of those articles I used as examples, they both had over 2 million views in the first day. So it's quite a bit more readership. And you can reach a global audience as well.
Can I ask, before I go to the next question, no hands have come up so far, but could I ask, the BBC's come in for a bit of a bashing in the last few years, hasn't it? I mean, it's been accused by the right of being left-wing, it's been accused by the left of being right-wing. The British Broadcasting Corporation, why are you working for this corporation when it's had such a big bashing recently, or is that water off a duck's back, which it seems to be?
Yeah,
it's retained its grandeur and its dignity, has it?
I think so. It's still it's the world's largest broadcaster, news broadcaster. It's also maintained a lot of its trust and prestige, regardless of sort of what people anecdotally say about bias both ways. It still tops the lists of readership trust. So when readers are asked readers or viewers are asked who they trust, which news sources they trust, the BBC always tops the list, both here and in the US, interestingly enough. So we have a lot of US audiences choosing the BBC over US networks. And actually, when I've done interviews with Americans, they say that. They say, I watch BBC and I read BBC online rather than our own news networks. So I think the BBC's general goal of impartiality, I think it's doing a pretty good job, obviously. Yes, I think it's doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, the World Service, of course, is still enormously trusted, isn't it, throughout the world? I've got a question here, which is for you and your thought processes from an anonymous attendee, AA. Do you write stories based on what the public wants, your personal desires, or a mixture of both? So is this author or audience, or somewhere in between? Difficult question in a way, isn't it?
It is. I think it's a bit of I wouldn't say it's my own personal desires. It's a bit of a mix of both. So sometimes if you see that audiences are really interested in a particular topic, you'll want to find a way of looking at that topic in a way they might be interested in, or telling a certain story that's related to that. And for example, when the protests were happening in Portland, Oregon in the US this year, there was huge interest in those. And then I did a couple of features on the sort of occupied protests in Portland and Seattle, which looked at it in a lot more detail.
This is the one with
that was kind of a combination of both what people want and what I'm interested in. I wouldn't say there are things where I'm like, this is my personal pet project and I want to spread this message, because that's not really my job. I'm a journalist, not an activist. But I take into consideration stories that I think are important and not really being told very widely, and also what people might be interested in. So the slaughterhouse story, for example, I mean, there was nothing that preceded that and no indication that that was a story that people really wanted to hear. But I thought this person's account was really compelling, and it was just something that hadn't been reported on basically at all. So I sort of went with it that way.
I felt that when I was reading your articles that I was hearing a voice from very much behind the scenes. And the slaughterhouse article, as you suggested, I've never read anything like that before in my life. It's a really a very close inside view. Related to what you just said, you mentioned Seattle, which was obviously with the Black House and so on. But for our younger aspiring members of the audience, you have traveled quite a lot, haven't you? Because you spent quite a lot of time in Russia, didn't you? You went to St. Petersburg and you wrote an article about, is it veganarchy? I don't know how you pronounce it, but I'm picking this. I've got some other questions lined up, but I'm picking this because I know an awful lot of students will be fascinated by that particular story about vegans and using food politically. So could you tell us something about it? Because that must have been fascinating.
Yeah, sure. Yes. So I, like you said, I went to Russia. Actually, I first went to Russia a few years ago, traveled around with my now husband, And while I was there, we met a bunch of vegan anarchists in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And then I thought, well, these guys are amazing. I really want to, write something about them or film them or something, because it's just, I'd never realized. I fully went there fully expecting to just, because we're both vegan, I fully expected to just eat bread for the whole month that we were there. But yeah, it was incredible to find this huge vegan scene, and also to find that they were like extremely politically active and had a very strong, like, specific ideology. So then I went back again the following year, just for a shorter trip, met them again, ate lots of food again, and then that time compiled a bit more sort of information about them, spoke to them in a bit more detail, and then took it back to my editors when I got back and pitched it as like a detailed look at this community. And then I was really lucky that they flew me out there, the BBC flew me out there for about a week to just spend time with them, just having conversations with them every day. I traveled there with a photographer who took some amazing photos of the food. And we discussed, politics, their activism. It's a community that's growing massively. A lot of the places that I found when I went there for the actual reporting trip were brand new. They just sprung up, and so the community was definitely thriving and expanding. So it was really.
There's a central bean carbohydrate food that vegans eat, isn't it? Is it called temle or something? I must find a recipe for that. Is it
yeah,
temle? Yeah. Temle. Right. I've got a question here from Philip Van Notten, and it's, what is the dream story that you have yet to write? Sorry, that's a tricky one, but I thought it was quite interesting.
That is a tricky one, actually, because so for a while, the vegan anarchist story and the slaughterhouse story were the dream stories that I kept failing to write. So I actually, both of those, I pitched to different editors, and a few different editors turned them down, until I found for each one editor who was like, no, this is a brilliant story, actually. So there was a sense with both of those where I felt like, is this ever going to happen, or is this just something that I've cooked up in my head? But now I'm not sure if I have something right now that I have yet to write that I would absolutely love to. That would be my dream. I just want to keep doing kind of what I'm doing now, telling these kind of stories. And obviously I'd love to write a book, but we'll see how that goes. I need to sit down and do it.
I remember a teacher once said to me, or it was a lecturer once said to me, that when we were reading Shakespeare, that even 400 years ago, people didn't really talk like that, because we all thought that 400 years ago everyone spoke in that sort of poetic language. I was thinking when I was reading his articles that the people you interviewed, they, given who they were and the state that they were in, they end up speaking very polished and very concise, very clear prose in your articles. And I just wondered about that editorial process, how that business of taking what they say and then producing that into a concise, presentable, polished piece of writing. Could you say something about that business of taking the raw material and turning it into a polished article at the end for the writers in the audience?
Sure. So if I'm interviewing someone in English, I don't change their quotes at all. Often people are just, once you strip out the ums and ahs from the transcripts, I mean, people express themselves, can express themselves really well, particularly if they feel very passionately about what they're talking about, or once you've spoken to them, like that's why I said about warming people up almost, spending a lot of time talking to them just about how they are, what they've been up to, who they are. Just tell me about yourself, and then that gets out all of the nervous energy, and then eventually they get into the swing of things, and then they express themselves quite nicely. With the Uber driver story, I interviewed her. We didn't interview her in English. I interviewed her in Canada, so that was in translation, but it was a pretty direct translation. although like obviously you have to slightly tweak a translation so that it makes sense in English, because kind of there's drastically different, it's a South Indian language, so there's drastically different sort of sentence structure and things. And my vegan anarchists piece, most of them were interviewed in Russian. So apart from those two, and any other, I can't think of any other pieces I've done actually where it's been in translation. One piece I did that came out today, one of the guys was interviewed in Somali, and with a translator. Obviously I don't speak Somali, but otherwise, yeah, I just keep what they say the same. With the slaughterhouse piece, that was written in as a first person narrative.
Yeah.
So that's quite different. Again, it was very true to what they said, and how they said it, but you have to condense 5 hours in total of interview time into a relatively short, like 1,300 or something word article. So after I wrote it up, I checked it with them a couple of times to make sure they were like 100%. It reflected what they had told me, and I hadn't left out, like I hadn't paraphrased something in a way that didn't reflect what they were trying to say. No, and only when they were completely happy with it, and happy that it was an accurate reflection of what they had told me, then did we publish.
That's great, thank you. That anticipated one of the questions actually that someone asked, whether you shared what you'd written with your interviewees before you published it, so they were happy with it. You that's what you do, is it?
So actually in that case, because it was such a sensitive subject, and also because there were legal implications with this person because they'd signed a non-disclosure agreement with their former employer. So in that case, I shared the text with them to make sure they were happy with it. Normally we don't actually share, we never share full stories with people before we publish. I might, if it's a sensitive subject, I might send them the quotes, their particular quotes.
Okay.
And I'll always go through and clarify, like over the phone, just go through and clarify all the details and facts and things like that. But I won't necessarily send them the full write-up.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for that. We have a question here from Pam Dewsbury. No, it wasn't that one. Sorry, it was an early one from Pam Dewsbury. I was right, actually. Sorry. Also, where are we? No, the question was from an anonymous attendee who wondered, do you have any particular pieces of journalism that have inspired you, or indeed journalists who have inspired you? A role model who kept you fired up in the early days, perhaps?
Yes. I mean, there are a couple of editors at work who I actually find quite inspiring, just because they, just talking to them about certain subjects, it just fires up my brain. Particularly, and they're particularly open to topics that they're not necessarily familiar with. So the editor who commissioned the piece on vegan anarchists had never heard of such a thing, but we spent hours just talking about the subject, and like anarchist ideology, and he actually went home, did a load of reading as well into the subject, and was sort of sending me stuff as well as I was sharing with him. So that's pretty inspirational. I don't know, in terms of journalists who inspired me early on, for example, to get into journalism, I grew up seeing Trevor McDonald on TV, and so I mean, that's sort of inspiring for me. But yeah, no, I mean, off the top of my head, it's probably a really boring answer, but the people who most inspired me are just the nice, great editors, inspirational editors that I've been lucky enough to work with.
That's great, thank you. And we have a question here. This is interesting. Another anonymous, sorry. Have you ever done covert observation? And if not, would you?
So there are a lot of it's a bit of a legally dicey area.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you're allowed to covertly record people. I think there has to be, if I'm correct, if you do, there has to be an extremely strong public interest angle to it, or just a public interest justification. I haven't, no, I haven't really needed to. I usually just tell people stories who are willing and desperate to tell their stories, but no one's really asked before.
So you have to keep your eyes and ears open. And we have a question here. This is all for all of those at King's at the moment. Do you think there was any experience at King's that particularly helped with your journalism career?
Yeah, so when I was, so I was really into English and RS, and actually like all the English teachers and RS teachers that I had when I was at school were incredible. They were all very smart, obviously, and very encouraging. And they got me involved in lots of extracurricular like groups and you know, little meetups after school and things like that, which just sort of inspired me to feel like, oh, okay, maybe this is something I'm interested in. And you know, even just having, for the first couple of years I was at school, I wasn't entirely sure exactly what I wanted to do. Journalism hadn't really crossed my mind until I was in about GCSE level, and then my GCSE teacher was like, you know, you should think about applying to Oxbridge for English, which I mean I did. I didn't get in, but they put that idea in my head, and you know, said you should look into journalism and various other careers that could use your writing skills, which isn't something I'd really even been aware that I had writing skills. I just thought, yeah, I like writing, but it's not really, I didn't really think I was very good at it. So having teachers who were encouraging and really pushed me was good. And also I used to write and get involved with the Canterbury as well, which was really good fun when I was doing.
There you go. I hope everyone heard that answer then. I'm conflating several questions here, actually. These are from young people, but also from their parents in several cases, it seems to me. What advice would you give? I mean, obviously, not a great deal of time has passed since you trained and entered the profession, but given what was said earlier about how quickly things change, what advice would you give now to someone who is about to leave school, in terms of a degree, but also in terms of training, and the top places to go to? I mean, I remember years ago, Cardiff was very good. There was the Elephant Castle, Preston was very good as well, but things have changed, presumably. City used to be very good years ago, in my time, but what would your advice be to someone leaving school with a view to the next two stages before they enter the profession?
So yeah, like you said, I mean, Cardiff and City are very good schools for journalism. I didn't study a degree in journalism, so I went about it in a bit of a roundabout way, and that's perfectly valid as well. If you have a subject that you really want to study and it's not journalism, like say, especially if it's English or history, but really anything, do it, and that will give you some good, you'll enjoy it, you'll get a better grade in your degree, and then you can still go into journalism afterwards. I have colleagues who studied all sorts of things, like I mean, you know, like the obvious ones like English, philosophy, theology, history, but then some other ones, like, and one of my colleagues who's a features writer for BBC Online as well, she studied maths. So really anything you're interested in can help. And because you, in journalism, you draw from such a wide like pool of knowledge, any kind of special expertise can help, especially if it's something a bit different. I did my master's degree in history of art, and for that I specialized in medieval manuscripts. So it's very much nothing to do with what I'm doing now, but even then I used some of that knowledge when, you know, that some of that medieval art and architecture knowledge when Notre Dame burnt down and I was on desk, for example. So really just study whatever you want. And if you want to go into straight news reporting and court reporting, there are short courses like the postgraduate diploma that I did, which are accredited by the NCTJ, which is the National Council for Training of Journalists. if you study that, then it teaches you all the basics of media law, which is just how not to get sued, shorthand, and various other important but very like vocational things. I did that part-time whilst already working as a journalist, so weekends and evenings for about 9 months, and then got the qualification afterwards.
So a degree in anything that you're passionate about, and then afterwards maybe a journalism qualification. Does it divide now, the diploma, the postgraduate diploma? Are they still divided? Obviously, I'm a bit vintage now, but are they still divided into broadcast and print, or are they sort of multimedia diploma courses now after university?
So when I did mine, which was about 6 years ago, there was NCTJ, which is just general journalism qualification, and then there's the BCTJ, which is broadcast specific. On my course, we could do a video and broadcast module, but it wasn't compulsory. I think in BCTJ you do a lot more like technical stuff with radio and TV producing. It's useful, but you don't really, like if you work for the BBC, you don't really need either of them, to be honest. They're more interested in what you can learn to do, your experiences, and there are certain things you can learn on the job. Like I've done radio packages without having a BCTJ or any like formal training. And also, I mean, I can't speak for other broadcasters or employers, but at the BBC, they have a really robust training academy that will train you up in various things. So a lot of people actually who work here don't have any journalism qualifications. Yeah. That's
very interesting, because there seems to be an assumption that you would need one in a lot of these questions I've got in front of me. Several people have asked, inevitably, and I was going to ask you this myself, now you're working at the BBC, which a lot of people think is the crowning glory. What next would you expect to do after the BBC? A lot of people have asked. You've intimated that you're happy where you are at the moment, but several people have asked, what would you do next if you were to move on?
I've never thought about it. So I sort of first decided I wanted to be a journalist around 15, 16, like I said, and then the goal was work for the BBC. And so now I work here. I've got a permanent contract. I don't really see myself leaving anytime soon. I would happily, I love my desk at the moment, my team at the moment, and what I'm doing, but I would, happily move around within the BBC to try different things, or they have some schemes so you can do secondments with different areas, and I could try TV, or I could try doing more radio, various things like that. So I don't really feel the need in terms of professional development or anything else to leave, which is probably why, so many people do join the BBC and then just stay for as long as they possibly can, for basically until retirement. There are a few places that are still like that now, but the BBC is definitely one of them, so I probably won't leave. If I were to leave, the only other possibility I can think of is if I write a best-selling novel, make millions, J.K. Rowling type money, and then leave, go to the Bahamas or something. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
And is that an aspiration to become a fiction writer?
No, yeah, I do want to write a fiction book. I don't know how lucrative my particular idea would be, but I'd like to try it. I've written 1 page of a fiction novel so far, so it's going well. After thinking in the first lockdown I'd have loads of free time and I'd be able to write a book, I've now written 1 page. But
1 page, the plot, because it will burst the bubble. And several people have asked, again, I'm trying to conflate a lot of questions so that we can cover a lot of material. They're asking about objectivity and subjectivity, and to what extent you find yourself, as I mentioned the phrase earlier, the moral purpose. Although you're being objective, and obviously everything you write has to be true, in your selection of subjects, for example, the underdog, for example, and the poor and the meek and the lowly, perhaps, who are being oppressed, Several people seem to want to know, do you choose your subjects according to some kind of moral purpose, or is it just because they haven't been covered before? What drives you? We were talking about morality and emotion earlier on, but what drives you to pick a story? And is it, do you have a moral agenda as a journalist? Do you think that journalists should have a moral agenda? That's the implication of 3 or 4 questions I've just read.
I wouldn't say I have a moral agenda necessarily. It's just being human, I guess. So like with the Uber driver story, like just going back to the example I've been using, I read about his story in a couple of lines in a news report, and it was so dry and so sort of straight to the point, like he was evicted and then he died. This sort of anonymous person, but like I still, just thinking about it, I felt there was so much going on as well at that time. Like I just felt so sad, and like sort of I was moved by the fact that this had happened and this had been allowed to happen. It's not necessarily, I'm on a moral crusade or I'm worthy and I want to, do activism, journalism activism at all. But it's, I gravitate towards stories that move me, and I hope they'll move other people as well, and also just paint a truer picture of the world we're living in. I guess what a common thread in a lot of what I write about is that these are people who, apart from the, it's interesting because they haven't been spoken to before, but it's more that these are whole groups of people that in general society tends to hide away or not think too much about. The slaughterhouse article being a good example of that. I mean, even animal rights activists, of whom I know many, won't really think about the actual workers in the slaughterhouses. The focus is on animal welfare or animal rights. And then on the other hand, you have the vast majority of the public who, of course, don't really think about workers' conditions for slaughterhouse workers. So it's just, if I hear of a story that I think moves me, and I know that this represents something wider in society, and I just want to tell people what kind of world we live in.
So I remember Truman Capote read a newspaper article about a farming family who'd been killed by 2 young men. They'd been tied up and shot, and it was a very short article, and he turned it into the novel In Cold Blood in 1966, which took him 7 years to write. Do you find yourself looking at news reports and being quite frustrated at how impersonal they are, and do you find yourself wondering about the truth behind them quite a lot? Because it seems that you've actually got inspiration from seeing that justice hasn't been done by that particular report. Do you find that quite a lot when you read news reports?
Not so much, because I write news reports as well, and I feel like they just do a different job. And a news report telling a story, even if it's a few lines long or something like that, in the first place, is still a huge deal, especially when it's somewhere with a quite wide reach. The vast majority of stories don't even make it that far. They won't. No one will find out about them. So I don't know if it's frustrated by the news reports not doing their job or not doing something that I would want them to do, but more, I see those few lines and then I feel like I want to look more into what's happened or talk to the people involved in them. News reports, just straight news reports, they play a really important role, though. People do need to just have the facts, and then sometimes you want to build on that.
So we have come full circle, because we began with defining the difference between a news report and a feature, and you've just said that they perform different functions. And at this particular point, I've got an eye on the clock, and I'd like to ask, if I may, I think I've done justice to most of those written questions. I hope I have anyway. The last one I was going to ask was, would you be happy for us to share links to your stories with the students? Because I really do think they're very moving, very original, unique pieces of journalism. And several people here haven't asked a question. They've just said thank you. They've just said thank you for uncovering the truth about various things, and letting, to quote one comment here, letting these people have a voice. So I think on that particular point, I think I'd love to thank you very much, and to ask Greg if he'd speak to you before we go. Ashitha, thank you. It's been lovely talking to you, really. Delightful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Wow.
Over to you, Greg.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you so much, Ashitha. That was just absolutely fantastic. It was wonderful. Ashitha, thank you so much for your insights into journalism and how to move your idea, move that idea, your vision, onto a final published piece, and whether it be written, audio, or video. Your honesty about all aspects of your work is both refreshing, compelling. There's no doubt you've inspired that next wave of journalists from King's. We at King's, we're very proud of what you're doing. Thank you.